we really need a very strong commitment to backward compatibility and like not breaking people's code, right? Creating packages that do not break people's code. And the way you do that is you learn base R, you become expert on base R. When you write packages, almost everything you do should be in base R. There's relatively few situations where you need to deviate from that. And if you do that, then commit yourself to backward compatibility, then you have a really strong set of packages that now the study programmers can use, and then that will make their code more stable.
Welcome to another episode of the Version Community Podcast. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome someone who knows everything about R. And if you're interested in using R in clinical programming, then this is an episode that you have to watch. David has so much experience on understanding what are the pros and cons, not at the low level, but what are the strategic decisions that you have to take in order to use R in the right way? What are the pros and cons versus SAS? If you're interested to speaking to David, he gives his contact details at the end of the episode. But this is really a must watch for anyone interested to learn about R, and I hope you enjoy it. David, it's so good to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to meet you, Thomas.
Likewise. So to get straight into it, you've got a fascinating background. And if I may share, you started, I believe, as a journalist. How do you end up from starting as a journalist into being one of the leaders in the R community in the very niche field of statistical programming for clinical trials?
Yeah, not only just a journalist, but after that, I was a philosopher. I went to school for philosophy.
Oh.
But basically, it happened in the mid 90s when the internet was booming, and I just saw a lot of opportunity. And I tried programming. I really loved it, and I've stayed with that ever since, basically. And I actually don't find it that different because you're doing logic and philosophy, and computer science is very logical, and you're also doing a lot of documentation. So both of those things have helped me a lot in my programming career.
Amazing. And how did you enter? What piqued your interest in R specifically that it's taken so much of your focus?
Well, in 2019, I had 3 clients. I've always been in consulting, and 3 major clients announced that they were moving away from SAS and towards open source, either R or Python. And this came as a real shock, right? Our consulting company had been doing SAS for 30 years. And what impressed me was that these were 3 clients from completely different industries. This was pharmaceuticals, insurance, and entertainment. And all of them said, just like within the span of a few months, we're leaving SAS. And I'm like, holy smokes. So this was clearly going to be a big wave. And our choices were either ride the wave or get crushed by the wave, right? So we decided to ride the wave, jump into open source. And the first thing I tried to do was create a clinical report, like a TLF in R. And I was incredibly surprised to see that I could not do it.
Right.
It spent weeks. And I'm seeing this like industry moving towards open source, and I'm seeing open source totally not ready for this industry, right? So I quit my project of creating my TLF after a few weeks and started developing packages to make this kind of work easier in open source. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
Amazing. Now, there's 2 topics that I know are particularly of interest to you, which is R maintainability and stability. Let's talk about that a little bit, because I think also just from my experience, there's very few people that actually appreciate. I mean, everyone in clinical programming knows about R. And one of the funny things I always talk about is that when you go to a conference like pharmaceutical, which is basically sponsored by SAS, half the talks are about moving away from SAS, which is always a bit uncomfortable for some of my contacts and my friends who are either salespeople or work at SAS. But staying with R for now, how would you describe the problem of maintainability, maintenance, stability in R?
Well, the basic problem, like anybody who's worked in R for any length of time, I'm sure you've experienced this. You write a program, you get it working perfectly, there's no errors or warnings, and then you go away for a couple months and work on something else and come back, rerun your program, and it doesn't work anymore. And you're like, wait, what happened? Like, I didn't change anything. And so you go to investigate that. You come down to some function and you're getting an error on that function. And you go to find out why, and eventually find your way back to the package documentation and look and say, oh, that function's been deprecated. Now use this function. I think a lot of people have seen that, and that's the kind of crux of the problem, is that in the open source world, packages can change, and there's nothing to stop people from changing them. I've worked in probably 15 different languages, and I've never actually seen this in any other language. So it's really seems to be a lot more common with the open source languages where we find this problem.
Did you have any specific examples of your experience in industry where this was a major issue?
Well, like if you're working by yourself, or maybe you're writing a research paper or something, it's not that big a deal. But like in industry, it's a really big deal because we're working at huge scale, right? So we got a clinical study with 1,000 programs in it, and I got hundreds of clinical studies in my company. And then on top of that, I have like an internally developed system with like 100,000 lines of code that's automating reports and automating data sets. And then we have multiple companies with thousands of studies and dozens of internal systems. And then and all this is sitting on like 500 R packages about.
Right.
And all it takes is for one of those 500 package developers to say, oh, I don't like the name of that function anymore. I'm going to call it this. And like this whole edifice comes crashing down, right? Yeah. So that's like, it's a very serious problem, actually. And I don't think there's been enough appreciation for this problem. It seems like people are starting to appreciate it now as they spend more time with R in this world.
And how do you think for some of the companies that are at the forefront of R, I think about Novo Nordisk, obviously about Roche, how do those companies or any others that you can think of addressing some of those problems?
It's addressed in a few different ways. So for those kind of big companies, they have like very large development teams with like dozens of developers. And so what they do is they're typically like on a release cycle, like every 6 months or so, they upgrade their R version. And then it's like all hands on deck, fix everything that's broken. And this can take anywhere from days to weeks to fix all the programs that are broken. And then they revalidate the system and re-release it, and then they carry on. For a smaller company that maybe doesn't have those resources to do all the fixing, what they actually do is just don't upgrade R, right? They just sit on the same version, sometimes for many years. And that's not a really great approach either. And so those are the two kind of main ways that people deal with it.
I remember a conversation I had a while back with a senior VP at a large pharma, and he always gets questioned by his seniors about why are we paying these millions of dollars to SaaS, and why can't we move to open source like R? Now, his response, and this is what they did at this company, was that, well, to make R work and to get rid of that SaaS license, I need to now hire a bunch of developers to have my own validation systems to ensure backwards compatibility and everything that you just spoke about. And his logic conclusion was that it's just not worth it. And also the stakes are really, really high. What would you say to someone like that? How would you deal with that?
I think that concern is valid. Like, I'm not going to dismiss it at all. So I think the way you have to do it, if you had the right approach for dealing with these kinds of problems in the open source community, I think it can work. And there are advantages to open source. The licensing cost is one thing, but also it's object oriented and the documentation systems are good. The internal development tools are very good. So there's definitely advantages if you use it in the right way. And I think if you did use it in the right way, it could be a viable replacement for SaaS.
So what about Docker containers and Renv? I know you've done some work on this. What's your view on how to best use them to address some of these issues?
So those are currently the best tools for dealing with the problem. Like sort of within a study, right? So a study can be sort of isolated in a way that like the internal reporting system can't, right? So the internal reporting system has to go across studies and persist over time. And so over there, it doesn't really help much. It's actually kind of a pain in the neck to use that all the time. And so for the studies, you can use it, but it's very difficult to use when you have a lot of people working on that study and you're trying to like coordinate all everybody's versions on their machines. And so I think it works, it fundamentally works, but I'd really like to see something better.
Yeah. And what do you say to those who just point to the inherent instability of open source? That it's something that there's a certain cultural inherent nature of having many people just going into a package, changing things, which is some of the stuff that you address. How would you describe those, or how do you think about these things?
Yeah. Well, there is inherent instability, but it's in the community developed packages, right? So R is organized with a core. So there's base R and about 30 packages or so developed and maintained by the R core team. And then there's all these community packages essentially sitting on top of that R core, right? So the community packages are inherently unstable, and there's not too much you can do about that. Our core itself is very stable. I would say about as stable as SAS. And they have to be because they have this entire thing, 20,000 or so R packages dependent on them. And these guys are very careful about backward compatibility, very slow to make changes. And so I think the kind of road to stability is basically through our core and base R.
So do you see so how do you see the community, the specific programming community in clinical addressing this? Is it through some of the packages that you've developed that are in use by the community? Is it through Admiral type Pharmaverse community-led engagements, or should it be sort of within each pharmaceutical company that they have their own validation systems? How do you see that interplaying?
I think the pharmaceutical community developed packages, that whole idea is extremely important. I think that's definitely part of the solution. But what I'd like to see is a little bit kind of cultural change in that community. And for people who are using R in pharmaceuticals generally, I think we need a cultural change. And then the other part of the solution is some sort of I'd like to see some sort of like verification system to check for backward compatibility and like publish that information, have it publicly available so that people can use that in interesting ways that could help us.
What do you mean by culture? What's the culture change that you would want to see?
So for those like internal package developers or people working on systems within the pharmaceutical industry, we really need a very strong commitment to backward compatibility and like not breaking people's code, right? Creating packages that do not break people's code. And the way you do that is you learn base R, you become expert on base R. When you write packages, almost everything you do should be in base R. There's relatively few situations where you need to deviate from that. And if you do that, then commit yourself to backward compatibility, then you have a really strong set of packages that now the study programmers can use, and then that will make their code more stable. Now, with the study programmers, I'm not expecting them to be expert programmers, and a lot of these people, they're moving from SAS and they're learning R. And when they learn R, the way they do it right now is they hit a problem, I want to do this. They do a Google search. It comes up with an answer, maybe on Stack Overflow or something that says, oh, use this package. Oh, so they use this package, use this function. They hit another problem. And, oh, now what do? They do another Google search that says, oh, use this other package. And they use that package and that. And so then, like, you get done with the program, and maybe it's a 200-line program, and you got 25 package references at the top. And the problem is they remember that. Yeah. And then they do it again, and they do it again. And so every time you add a package reference, you're essentially inviting that package developer to break your code, right? And the more package references you have, the greater opportunity is for your code to break. So we really need to get everybody all up and down the pharma community to like minimize the number of packages that they're using, and the ones that they are using, make sure that those are as stable as possible.
So, what's your take on how do you build such a backwards compatibility, dependency management, transitive dependency management system? What would you recommend to the community?
If we were talking about like electrical equipment, toasters and stoves and any kind of electrical equipment, what we have, at least in the United States, is this organization called Underwriters Laboratories, right? And so this is like a testing facility where you develop a new toaster, you send it to Underwriters Laboratories, they run it through a series of tests, and they confirm, yes, this thing is safe for consumer use. And the reason this organization arose is because a long time ago, companies would create these products and immediately start selling them to consumers, and like they'd catch on fire or they'd electrocute the consumer or something. So this organization was developed to protect people, right? And so shouldn't we have one of these for open source, right? That some sort of organization, independent organization, you could send your packages to, they could test it for compatibility, and if everything worked out, you get a score or a badge or something that you can stick on your website that says, hey, this package is 100% backwards compatible. Not only is it backwards compatible to the last version, but I've been backwards compatible for 3 years.
Right.
Look,
right.
And that this could be something like you're very proud of, right? And I think people should be proud of that you are developing a package that has been backward compatible for a long time. And so the package developers should strive for this, and the package consumers should look for it, right? They want to look for packages that are stable. And if that sort of idea takes off, then it'll eventually lead to a system that's much more stable. Right now, this is not addressed at all anywhere, right? And so that would kind of address that problem.
So what about the FDA then? How do they, I guess that sort of, is this something the FDA should lead? Is something that should be sanctioned through a regulatory agency? Or how would FDA reproducibility fall into play here?
They've been very generous and very patient with the R community. They're incredibly helpful. You watch their interviews, they're wonderful. I don't know if it should be regulated per se, but I'd like to make it much easier for the FDA. One of the things they say in their interviews is that, they're very busy. They have a lot of studies they're working on, and like they don't have time to mess around with this stuff. and they've actually mentioned that the compatibility issue and getting their environment set up is much more difficult than SAS, which is obviously true, right? When I send SAS code to the FDA, they run it typically on whatever version of SAS code they have, and it always runs. So we need some sort of way to make this much easier for them. And what I'm thinking of is if I had that sort of database of backward compatibility between package versions, what you could do is just check for compatible versions instead of the exact version. So right now, what we do when we send R to the FDA, pilot studies or whatever, we send them the R&V, and you need like these exact versions of all these different hundreds of packages, and then any sort of deviation they have to go fix. So I think if we had a compatibility check rather than an exact version check, that would make it much easier for them and much easier for us.
And more generally, in your view, what are the risks of staying in the same course? And maybe to add to that as well, the rate, obviously R and open source in general is not a new thing in software, but within statistical programming in clinical, it is a fairly new thing, but it's been a new thing for, I guess, close to a decade by now. What are the risks of staying in this course?
Well, I worry about what you mentioned a minute ago with those executives who are saying, like, why do I need to pay all these developers? So the maintainability aspect could be a serious problem. if there's any like errors that arise from this that occur in a submission, that's going to be a problem. There's this statistical incompatibility thing, which also can slow down submissions, right? And so I think these are very serious problems that like they need to be addressed if we really want to make this technology viable in the pharmaceutical industry. And for all the issues that you mentioned earlier, if the submissions get delayed too much,
Yeah.
then that negates any cost savings on using open source, right? And then it seems better from the executive's perspective, just stay on SaaS, right? And then we don't have this problem. So they will bite the bullet and stay on SaaS rather than deal with all this chaos that's happening in open source. But I do think they can be addressed.
Now, we have to always talk about AI these days. What's your take on AI in this field? What have you seen within the R space that people should know about?
Well, it's an awesome technology, and there's a lot of advancements being made. It seems like every week something new happens. In terms of like setting the goals for what we want to do with this technology and how we use it, well, it's not going to change that at all, right? So the humans have to set the goals. If we're talking about culture change or changes to training programs, how we teach R, right? How we teach our programmers to use R, AI doesn't help with that either, right? That's on us. Where it might be able to help is, I have this program and it has 25 package references. Can I rewrite this in base R, give it to the AI, show me how to do it? Ultimately, that learning has to be internalized by the programmers, right? That's the most efficient way to do it. But that's the only place I really see it helping is potential remediation of code and translation of code into more stable programs.
And I guess staying with the future a little bit beyond just AI, what's your take on the future in clinical trials?
I think it has a promising future if we can fix these problems. Like I was mentioning a minute ago, there's a lot of advantages to R, right? So the graphical capabilities are amazing. The development systems, the development tools are amazing. The whole idea of getting different companies together to work on tools is so great, right? And the GitHub sharing of code and community development of packages, this is all super exciting stuff. And I think it could really be great if we address these kind of fundamental problems that we've been talking about.
So let's stay with SAS a little bit there, because I think it is helpful, because I don't think most programmers actually understand what the fuss about R is about, other than just open source and perhaps the cost implication. To you, other than perhaps the backward compatibility, what are the main distinctions? I guess maybe pros and cons between R and SAS.
Well, the thing that is most interesting, I think, about open source is if there's something that you don't like about the language, you can fix it, right? You're in full control of the language that you're using to do your work. And that's what I think is most exciting about open source, whereas SAS, you can submit a request or something, can I add this feature? And a few years later, it might get back to you. So we're kind of in control of our own destiny. And, that's what I think is so great and why there's such potential here. But we really need to make that destiny good and make it stable and make it set the priorities that we need in the pharmaceutical industry. So stability needs to be like the highest, in my view, the highest priority. And like, that's what I think.
And when we talk about compatibility between SAS and what are some concerning differences that you've encountered?
Well, the statistical incompatibility is a really big deal, and the FDA in their interviews when they review our packages, they talk about this, and what happens is that an R statistical function will produce a little bit different result than the SAS function, and what they have to do is walk it up to the senior statistician and approve that discrepancy. So why is that discrepancy happening in the first place? Well, it's because the SAS procedure may have been developed in 1980, and when they developed that procedure, they developed it with the state-of-the-art statistical method that was in use in 1980. They made that the default, and as time progressed, if new developments in statistics came about, they would add those as options. They care about backward compatibility, so they left the default with the original statistical method, added the new statistical methods as options. Whereas R was developed in 2000, right? At that time, the state of the art was different. They made their default the state of the art at that time. And if they wanted to be backward compatible with SAS, they put an option to go back to the SAS way of doing it. So the statistics, the techniques are actually there in both SAS and R, but the default is different. So if you want them to match, you got to read through the documentation and figure them out. Which options do I use to make it match SAS? And that takes a lot of time. And there's a lot of packages, and you don't even know which packages has the version that's compatible with SAS. So this is also a very serious problem. And as I mentioned, this contributes to the potential slowing down of submissions that are done in R, which is very dangerous, this entire project. As I said, if it gets too slow, then they'll abandon it.
And are there any particular tools that you use or that you would recommend to address package stability?
Well, I'm actually working on one right now called PackageDiff, and that's supposed to compare two packages and check for backward compatibility. What it does is it looks at the published namespaces and compares those two namespaces and find out whether there's any functions that have been dropped or function parameters that have been dropped. So I think this will help or could provide like a foundation for addressing this issue, and maybe at some point in the future using it to create, like I was mentioning earlier, some sort of like database that you can just like look up, is this compatible or not? And maybe have a web service or an API sitting on that on top of that you could just sort of quickly determine the compatibility between two package versions. And that would be incredibly powerful.
Well, if anyone's listening here, I think that's a great tool that someone should build. So I think that's a great call to action. Could I ask you, I guess, as we're nearing to the end of the episode, and this has been fascinating. I think so many people have to listen to the level of technicality that you go into, and especially the beyond the theory and the actual practicality of using R in clinical. If I could put you on the spot here with a simple yes or no, in the next 10, let's say 5 to 10 years, do you expect R to overtake SAS as the dominant language in clinical?
Yes or no? So my real answer is I don't know. Yeah, it depends on fixing some of these problems that we have, and they're not easy to fix. We're talking about cultural change. People need to get on board with that idea, right? And not one person can do that. So if these organizations and the developer communities address this head on, it's possible. It's hard to say at this point.
Of course. No, absolutely understand. And I guess as a final question, is there any major things that you have changed your mind on in the past year that surprised you, that you feel more invigorated about, or perhaps not so invigorated?
It's good and bad, right? So there's, as I've mentioned a couple of times, so much possibility, and we just need to figure out how to use it in the right way. That's really my main message. And I think that the training issue that I mentioned earlier is a big deal. We really need to teach people how to program in a defensive way, right? As I mentioned, every time you add a package reference, you open yourself up to breakages. So minimize as much as you can these chaotic influences and just focus on base R, develop great tools, develop stable tools, and I think this technology could really work.
David, I want to thank you so much for this conversation. I dare to say that This may be one of the most important conversations that anyone that's looking at R should listen to, especially as a high level strategic introduction to R, other than just how to use the IDE. And if anyone wants to get in touch with you, what would be the best way to do that?
Probably email dbosak01, DBOSAK01 @gmail.com.
Awesome. David, any final words to our audience before we wrap up?
No, I just appreciate the interview and thank you for all the work you've done.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.